Across the brush country and the Nueces Strip, where mesquite tore at a rider's sleeves and the nearest help sat 3 days south, the Texas Rangers carried iron that history has half forgotten. Not the polished revolvers of legend, but the working guns that rode in saddle scabbards through fights nobody wrote down. From 5-shot cap and ball pistols that turned mounted warfare to lever guns that ruled the open ground, each weapon fed a story of dust, blood, and the men who tamed a hard country. Which gun rode through every gunfight that mattered? Let's begin the countdown with number 25. The Bowie knife rode on a ranger's hip long before the revolver came to define him. A heavy clip-point blade that settled close work when powder ran out, or the fight came to arm's length. Frontier smiths in towns like San Antonio and Bastrop hammered them from wagon iron and worn files, fitting blades 9 to 12 inches long into horn or hardwood grips wrapped in rawhide. A good one cost about $1.50 in the 1840s, cheap enough for a young man riding out to join Hayes's company. Rangers used it to skin game on the trail, cut saddle leather, and finish a fight that a spent pistol could not. Oral histories from the early San Antonio companies recall men who trusted the blade over any single-shot pistol because steel never misfired in the rain. The handle darkened with sweat and years, and the edge grew thin from 1,000 passes over a creek stone. It was the first weapon a ranger reached for and the last one that ever failed him. Number 24. The single-shot flintlock horse pistol filled a saddle holster in the earliest years of the Rangers, a heavy smoothbore that threw a round ball hard enough to drop a man or a horse at close range. Most came down from militia stores or were carried west from Tennessee and Kentucky, their brass-mounted stocks scarred from hard travel across the Sabine. A serviceable pair cost around $8 in the 1830s, a real sum for a mounted man who lived on irregular pay. Rangers carried them in pommel holsters, one on each side, drawing the first at the charge and the second when the first had spoken. Oral histories from the Robertson colony describe riders who fired both pistols into a Comanche charge, then fell back on the blade because reloading from horseback was a fool's hope. The flint threw sparks that a damp morning could kill, and every man knew the sick feeling of a pan that flashed but would not fire. Still, in steady hands, the horse pistol bought the seconds that kept a ranger alive, and more than one pair hung above a cabin door long after the man who fired them had gone to dust. Number 23. The Kentucky rifle, long and slender and deadly past 200 yards, came to Texas in the hands of men who had learned to shoot in the eastern woods before they ever saw the open prairie. Built by Pennsylvania and Tennessee gunsmiths from about 1790 onward, the graceful flintlocks carried barrels up to 44 inches, rifled for a patched ball the size of a pea, and accurate enough to split a playing card at 50 paces. A fine one cost $15 or more in the 1830s, a fortune that a ranger often inherited rather than bought. On the plains, the long rifle showed its one weakness, for a man could not reload it at a gallop, and the mounted tribes learned to draw its fire and rush the empty barrel. Oral histories from the Bastrop settlements recall marksmen who could drop a raider from the saddle across a full field, then found themselves defenseless in the 10 seconds it took to reload. Rangers prized it for the picket line and the ambush, where a single well-placed ball ended a fight before it began. The maple stock glowed with age, and the barrel browned to the color of old coffee. Number 22. The percussion cap muzzleloader replaced the temperamental flint through the 1840s, a weapon that fired in rain and river fog when the older locks fell silent. A copper cap costing about a penny apiece struck a spark far more reliable than steel on stone, and Texas gunsmiths converted hundreds of old flintlocks to the new system for a couple of dollars a gun. Rangers carried the caplock rifle in a saddle scabbard, a leather ball pouch and a brass powder flask riding on the belt beside it. Oral histories from the Noose's country describe men who swore by the caplock through the whole decade, insisting it threw a truer ball and never left them staring at a dead flint in a downpour. A well-kept caplock could shoot for 50 years, and some rode through the whole span of the frontier companies. The conversion cost a ranger less than $2, but on a wet morning in the brush, it was the cheapest life insurance a fighting man ever bought. Number 21. The pepperbox pistol, an ungainly cluster of 4 to 6 barrels turning on a central axis, gave a ranger a repeating pistol years before the true revolver reached the frontier. Made by Eastern firms like Allen and Thurber from the 1830s onward, the little multi-barreled guns cost around $10 and rode easy in a coat pocket or a saddlebag. They were miserable to aim, top-heavy and slow, and old hands joked that a pepperbox was as dangerous to the man behind it as the man in front. Still, in a close scrape, it put 4 or 5 shots under a ranger's thumb when a single shot would have left him empty. Oral histories from the Gonzales companies recall riders who kept a pepperbox as a hideout gun, drawing it when a fight closed to spitting distance and the long guns were spent. The barrels fouled quickly and the aim wandered, but 5 chances beat 1 when the brush was full of trouble. The bluing wore to gray in the pocket, and the trigger grew slick from nervous hands. Number 20. The cavalry saber, curved and bright and older than the Republic, hung from more than one ranger's saddle in the earliest days, a cutting weapon carried by men who had soldiered before they scouted. Most were surplus Dragoon blades from the eastern armories or captured Mexican patterns taken in the border fighting, worth perhaps $5 in trade in the 1840s. Rangers were never true cavalry, and most came to trust powder over steel. But a saber served for close-mounted work, for cutting brush, and for the reach it gave a man pressed against a wall of horses. Oral histories from the Somerville expedition recall a few riders who carried the blade through the whole campaign, using it more for camp work than for war. The men who carried one learned fast that a revolver beat a sword in the brush country. The frontier had no more use for the saber than for the men's old regiments, and the bright blade slid to the bottom of the pack, remembered only when an old ranger drew one out to show a grandchild what soldiering once looked like. Number 19. The Colt Paterson revolver changed everything the moment it reached a ranger's hand, the first practical repeating pistol to ride the Texas frontier, and the gun that turned a losing fight into an even one. Samuel Colt patented the 5-shot in 1836, and a shipment of the .36 caliber models found its way to Jack Hayes's company in the years that followed, each one costing around $40, a staggering sum for a mounted man on frontier pay. Before the Paterson, a ranger fired his 1 or 2 shots and then faced a mounted warrior who could loose a dozen arrows in the time it took to reload. Oral histories from Hayes' company recall the fight at Walker's Creek in 1844, when a handful of rangers armed with Patersons broke a far larger Comanche force that had never faced repeating fire from the saddle. The revolver spun 5 shots where the old guns gave 1, and the mounted tribes learned a new and bitter arithmetic that afternoon. The folding trigger dropped when the hammer cocked, and the balance rode light in a galloping hand. It was the gun that made the ranger something new on the plains. Number 18. The Colt Walker revolver, forged from the hard lessons of the Paterson and weighing nearly 5 pounds fully loaded, gave the mounted ranger more raw power than any handgun before it. Samuel Walker, a ranger who had ridden with Hayes and fought the Comanche firsthand, sat with Colt in 1846 to design a bigger, stronger 6-gun, and the result threw a .44 caliber ball on a 60-grain charge, more powder than any production pistol of its day. Only 1,000 of the military models were made, and an original cost the government about $25, though a ranger who carried one held something close to priceless. Oral histories tied to Samuel Walker's own service recall that he carried a pair of the pistols bearing his name into the Mexican War, where he fell at Huamantla in 1847 with the gun still on him. And the border companies long swore the Walker's blow could drop a horse or punch through a man and the saddle behind him. The great pistol was slow to load and heavy on the hip, and the early cylinders sometimes burst under the punishing charge. Yet a ranger who trusted his Walker rode into the brush knowing he carried 6 shots of authority no enemy could match. The barrel scorched black with firing, and the grip filled a big man's hand, number 17. The Colt Dragoon followed the Walker and fixed its every fault. A .44 caliber 6-gun trimmed to a manageable 4 pounds and built strong enough to survive the heavy charges that had burst the earlier cylinders. Colt produced the Dragoon from 1848 onward, refining it through 3 model changes, and the big revolvers sold for around $25 to $30 as they trickled into Texas through military channels and private hands. Rangers carried them in saddle holsters, often in pairs, giving a single rider 12 shots before he ever touched powder and ball again. Oral histories from Ripford's company recall men who rode the whole border with a brace of dragoons across the pommel, trusting them over any lighter gun the East could offer. The Dragoon balanced power and reliability as no pistol had before it, and it became the working 6-gun of the hard years between the Mexican War and the cartridge age. The color case hardening faded to silver, and the walnut grips wore smooth as riverstone. When a ranger needed a pistol that would not fail him, the Dragoon answered every time. Number 16, the Colt 1851 Navy revolver, lighter and faster than the great horse pistols, became the favorite belt gun of rangers who wanted power they could carry all day without a saddle to bear the weight. Chambered in .36 caliber and introduced in 1850, the Navy balanced perfectly in the hand, and its 6 shots came quick and pointed true, earning it a devotion that lasted decades. A new Navy cost about $20 in the 1850s, and a ranger often spent a month's pay to own one that rode on his hip rather than his horse. Oral histories from the Rio Grande companies recall men who wore a pair of navies butt forward for the cross draw, clearing leather in a heartbeat when the brush erupted. The revolver pointed like a finger and recovered fast between shots, letting a skilled hand empty all 6 with deadly speed. Gunmen and rangers alike swore the Navy was the finest balanced pistol a man could point, and Wild Bill Hickok himself wore a pair to his grave, butts forward, long after the cartridge guns had made him a relic. Number 15. The Mississippi rifle, a .54 caliber percussion muzzleloader issued to volunteers in the Mexican War, found its way into ranger hands as a hard-hitting long arm for work past pistol range. Made at the federal armories from 1841 onward, the sturdy rifle carried a 33-inch barrel and threw a heavy ball, with accuracy the smoothbores could never match, and surplus examples sold for a few dollars in the years after the war. Rangers valued it for the ambush and the standoff fight, where reach and stopping power decided the day before an enemy closed the ground. Oral histories from the Border Service recall riders who kept a Mississippi rifle in the saddle scabbard for the long shot, saving the revolvers for the close scramble that always seemed to follow. The muzzle loader was slow to reload, but a single well-placed ball ended arguments at 200 yards. The brass patch box gleamed against the dark walnut, and the barrel browned with the seasons. It bridged the gap between the old rifles and the repeaters still to come. Number 14. The Colt 1860 Army revolver refined the big 6-gun into its finest cap and ball form, a .44 caliber weapon that carried the power of the Dragoon in a frame nearly as light as the Navy. Colt introduced it in 1860, and the streamlined revolver with its creeping loading lever and rebaited cylinder became the standard heavy sidearm of the era, selling for around $20 as it spread across Texas. Rangers who could get one prized the combination of striking force and handling ease, for it hit like the old horse pistols yet rode comfortably on the belt. Oral histories from the post-war companies describe men who carried the 1860 through the hard years of Reconstruction, when the line between Ranger, Outlaw, and Avenger blurred in the border country. The revolver balanced beautifully and threw its heavy ball with authority, closing the cap and ball age on its highest note. The blued barrel wore to gray along the holster line, and the grip darkened with the oil of a working hand. It was the last and best of the percussion 6-guns before the cartridge changed the world. Number 13. The Sharps Carbine, a breech-loading single shot that a man could reload from the saddle, gave Rangers a rate of fire the muzzle loaders could never approach in the years before true repeaters arrived. Christian Sharps patented his falling block action in 1848, and the carbines chambered a linen or paper cartridge that dropped into the breech in seconds, letting a mounted man fire and load again without ever spilling powder down a barrel. A Sharps carbine cost around $30 in the 1850s, and the ones that reached Texas rode in scabbards from the border to the panhandle. Oral histories from McNally's company recall the fight along the river near Las Cuevas in 1875, when a small band of Rangers crossed into Mexico after stolen cattle and held off a far larger force with rapid breech-loading fire that older weapons could never have matched. The breech-loader spoke fast and hit hard, bridging the long gap between the single ball and the 16-shot repeater. The saddle ring wore bright against the wood, and the breech block grew slick with use. When a Ranger needed to reload without dismounting into danger, the Sharps carried him through. Number 12. The Henry Rifle, a 16-shot lever-action repeater that a man could load on Sunday and fire all week, put more firepower in a Ranger's hands than anything the frontier had ever seen. Benjamin Tyler, Henry patented the brass-framed rifle in 1860, and it fed a .44 rimfire cartridge from a tube beneath the barrel, letting a single rider throw a storm of lead where the old guns gave one shot at a time. A Henry cost around $40 in the 1860s, dear money that a Ranger paid gladly for the edge it bought him in a running fight. Oral histories from the post-war companies recall men who broke ambushes single-handed, working the lever as fast as thought while startled attackers counted on a pause that never came. The rifle grew hot in a long fight, and the brass frame took on the warmth of a living thing under a working hand. Its magazine ran dry fast, but 16 shots settled most arguments before they got that far. The men who faced it in other hands feared the rifle that never seemed to run empty, and a Ranger who levered a Henry knew his enemy was counting on a pause that would never come. Number 11. The Winchester Model 1866, the yellow boy that improved on the Henry, closed the rifle's weaknesses, and became one of the most trusted repeaters on the Texas frontier. Winchester added a loading gate on the side of the brass receiver in 1866, letting a Ranger top off the magazine without pulling it apart, and a wooden forearm that spared his hand from the hot barrel. The rifle cost around $40 new, and its .44 rimfire cartridge fed smooth and fast through the improved action that almost never jammed. Oral histories from the Frontier Battalion recall riders who carried the Yellow Boy through the worst of the border troubles, trusting its rapid fire when a single shot meant a man's death. The brass receiver glowed like gold in the sun and gave the rifle its lasting name across the whole Southwest. Rangers could reload on the move and keep the tube full through a long fight, a luxury the Henry never gave them. The action ran slick with use, and the brass wore soft and bright. It was firepower a mounted man could finally depend on. Number 10. The Spencer Repeating Rifle, a 7-shot lever gun fed from a tube through the buttstock, flooded into Texas as war surplus, and gave many a Ranger his first taste of true repeating fire. Christopher Spencer patented the rifle in 1860, and its stout rolling action chambered a .52 caliber rimfire cartridge that hit far harder than the lighter repeaters, dropping a man or a horse with authority. Surplus Spencers sold cheap after the war, sometimes for $10 or $15, putting a repeater within reach of companies that could never afford a Henry for every man. Oral histories from the Reconstruction years recall rangers and state lawmen who carried war surplus Spencers through the lawless border troubles of the early 1870s, loading the tube through the stock and thumbing the hammer between shots when a lone rider faced a whole band. The Spencer struck hard where the rimfire repeaters struck fast, and its heavy ball ended fights the lighter guns only prolonged. The metal wore gray with hard service, and the stock cracked and was bound with rawhide by more than one owner. It was cheap, strong, and deadly, and it armed the frontier through lean years. Number 9. The Remington model, 1875, built to challenge the Colt's grip on the cartridge revolver, gave the Ranger a heavy and reliable 6-gun from a maker whose iron he already trusted. Remington chambered the big single action for the .44 and .45 rounds from 1875 onward, hanging it on the same web-strong frame that made the company's rolling blocks famous, and it sold for around $15 as it drifted into Texas holsters. Rangers who carried one found it every bit the equal of the Colt in power and reach, with a distinctive web beneath the barrel that let a man tell it in the dark by feel alone. Oral histories from the companies working the Big Bend recall riders who chose the Remington for its balance and its honest weight, trusting it through border scrapes where a jammed gun meant a dead man. The revolver threw the same heavy ball as its famous rival and swallowed the dust and damp of the brush country without complaint. The man who wore one carried Remington's answer to Colt on his hip, every bit as deadly and half as celebrated. Number 8. The Winchester model, 1873, the rifle they called the gun that won. The West married perfectly with the Ranger's revolver by firing the very same cartridge from a stronger, faster action. Winchester chambered the 1873 for the .44-40 centerfire round in that year, and a Ranger who carried both rifle and pistol in the same caliber could feed either from a single belt, a convenience worth its weight in blood on a long scout. The rifle cost around $25, and its iron frame handled pressures the old brass guns could not. Oral histories from Lee Hall's company recall Ranger John Armstrong, who ran down the outlaw John Wesley Hardin on a train in 1877, trusting the same class of Winchester and Colt that let a lone lawman take the deadliest gunman in Texas alive. The 1873 levered smooth and fast, holding 15 rounds in the tube for the kind of sustained fire a lone Ranger sometimes needed to survive. The receiver blew deep and wore bright at the edges, and the lever polished silver from 10,000 strokes. It was the working repeater of a generation. Number 7. The Sharps model, 1874 Buffalo rifle, a single shot chambered in cartridges heavy enough to drop a bull at half a mile, gave the Ranger reach that no repeater of the day could touch. Sharps built the falling block rifle for the Buffalo range in calibers like the mighty .45-70 and .50-90, and a few found their way into Ranger hands for the long shot across open country where a fight was decided before it began. A business rifle cost around $30, and its cartridges ran a dime apiece, real money spent only when the shot had to count. Oral histories from the panhandle companies recall marksmen who reached across whole valleys with a Sharps, ending a standoff with a single heavy ball that carried far past the range of any lever gun. The rifle kicked like a mule and loaded slow, but in the hands of a patient man, it was death at distances others only dreamed of. A Ranger who owned a Sharps rarely had to fire it twice, for the first heavy ball crossing a valley told every man on the far ridge exactly what kind of reach he was up against. Number 6. The Winchester model. 1892, lighter and slicker than the guns that came before it, arrived in Ranger scabbards as the frontier faded into the new century and the companies traded horseback pursuit for the railroad and the automobile. John Moses Browning designed the trim little repeater in 1892, chambering it for pistol cartridges like the .44-40 and .38-40, and the rifle sold for around $18 as it spread across the state. Rangers of the later era carried it for its quick handling and flawless action, a saddle gun that levered faster than a man could think and never seemed to jam. Oral histories from the turn-of-century companies recall riders who ran down cattle thieves and border raiders with a .92 across the pommel, trusting its rapid fire in the last of the mounted fights. The rifle balanced light in the hand and pointed like a natural extension of the arm, closing the age of the lever gun on a high note. The bluing wore to gray along the magazine tube, and the lever polished bright from constant work. It rode through the twilight of the old frontier. Number 5. The Colt 1911 automatic pistol marked the moment the Ranger stepped fully into the modern age. A self-loading sidearm that threw 7 fat .45 cartridges as fast as a finger could pull the trigger. John Browning designed the pistol that the Army adopted in 1911, and it reached Ranger holsters in the years that followed, most of them issue and surplus guns that the government had bought for around $15 apiece. The automatic reloaded itself with each shot, and a Ranger could carry a spare magazine to refill the gun in a heartbeat, a speed the old single actions never approached. Oral histories from the border troubles of the 1910s recall Rangers who traded the six-shooter for the 1911 during the hard years of the Mexican Revolution, when raids crossed the river and firepower meant survival. The pistol hit with the same heavy .45 authority the Rangers had always trusted, delivered now with the speed of the new century. The blued slide wore silver at the muzzle, and the grip checkering smoothed under a working thumb. It carried the old power into a new age of gunfights. Number 4. The Winchester model. 1894, chambered for the smokeless .30-30 cartridge, became the deer rifle and the fighting rifle of the modern Ranger, reaching farther and flatter than any lever gun before it. Browning designed the 1894, and Winchester chambered it for the .30-30 in 1895, the first American sporting round built for smokeless powder, and the rifle sold for around $18 as it spread from the Panhandle to the Rio Grande. Rangers valued the flat trajectory and hard-hitting reach, for the little bottleneck cartridge shot straighter at distance than the old pistol rounds ever could. Oral histories from the early state force recall men who carried a .94 through the last mounted patrols, dropping a target at ranges the .73 could never reach. The rifle levered smooth and fast, holding 6 rounds in the tube and answering a fight with authority at 200 yards. The receiver wore bright at the loading gate, and the walnut darkened with oil and hard weather. It was the rifle that carried the Ranger legend into the 20th century. Number 3. The Remington rolling block, a single shot of legendary strength with just 2 moving parts behind the cartridge, served the Ranger as a rifle that almost never broke no matter how hard the country used it. Remington built the rolling block from 1867 onward in calibers, from the modest .44 to the heavy .50-70, and the action was famous for swallowing dirt, damp, and abuse that would have jammed a finer gun. A sporting model cost around $16, and its simple mechanism made it a favorite where a broken rifle meant a dead man far from any gunsmith. Oral histories from the frontier companies recall riders who trusted the rolling block for its sheer reliability, knowing the heavy action would fire when a repeater choked on grit. The single shot demanded a steady hand and a cool head, for a man had only one before the reload, but a well-aimed ball ended most fights outright. The barrel browned with the seasons, and the block wore slick from 10,000 cycles. It was the rifle a Ranger bet his life on. Number 2. The Smith & Wesson Schofield, a top-break revolver that a Ranger could reload in half the time, a Colt demanded, earned a devoted following among the men who valued speed above all, in a close and desperate fight. Smith & Wesson built the Big .456 gun from 1875 onward, improving it to the design of Major George Schofield, and its hinged frame swung open at a touch to eject all 6 empties at once, while a Colt gave up its brass one slow chamber at a time. A Schofield sold for around $15, and the ones that reached Texas rode on the hips of Rangers, who had learned that a fast reload could be the difference between walking away and lying in the brush. Oral histories from the Del Rio companies recall men who swore by the top break in a running fight, dumping 6 spent shells and thumbing in fresh rounds while a Colt man still worked his ejector rod. The revolver hit with the same heavy authority the Rangers trusted, delivered from a gun that opened and closed like a steel trap. The nickel finish wore thin along the holster line, and the grip smoothed to the shape of a hard hand. When the fight ran long and the cylinder ran dry, the Schofield gave a man his shots back faster than any wheel gun on the frontier. And finally, in first place, the Colt single. Action Army crowned the Rangers' arms as the revolver that came to stand for the whole tradition, the 6-shooter that rode through the cartridge age and never left the Texan hip. Colt built it from 1873 onward, chambered most often in the hard-hitting .45 long Colt. And the Peacemaker balanced power, speed, and reliability as no revolver had before it, selling for around $17 from the factory. Rangers carried it through the last Indian fights, the border troubles, the range wars, and the long, slow taming of a violent country, wearing the same gun until the grips fit their hands like a memory. A skilled man could clear leather and fire in the blink of an eye, place 6 shots where he called them, and reload in the time it took an enemy to think. Oral histories from every corner of Texas describe the Colt 45 as the gun that finished arguments, the weapon a Ranger trusted above his horse, his badge, and his own 2 hands. The bluing wore to silver along the holster line, the walnut darkened with sweat and oil, and the action smoothed to glass through 10,000 draws. Some of those revolvers passed from father to son through 3 generations of lawmen, their barrels re-blued, their springs replaced, their grips carved with the initials of men long dead. The Colt Single Action Army was more than a sidearm. It was the steel that stood between a lone rider and a lawless country, the tool that let one man face many and walk out alive. When a Ranger buckled on a Peacemaker, he strapped on the whole history of Texas in a single piece of walnut and iron. Across all 25 weapons, from the plain Bowie knife honed on saddle leather to the legendary Colt that finished 1,000 fights, these guns tell a hard and honest story of the men who carried them through country that gave no mercy. Some, like the horse pistol and the pepper box, were clumsy tools that a Ranger trusted only because he had nothing better. Others, like the Paterson and the Peacemaker, changed the very nature of a fight and turned a handful of riders into a legend the border never forgot. But every one of them earned its place in the scabbard by working hard, firing true, and answering when a lone man's life hung on the next shot. These were not showpieces behind museum glass. They were the tools of survival, carried through dust and blood and forgotten fights, and their memory still rides wherever the story of the Texas Rangers is told.